What happens when the world's most controversial billionaire sits down with late-night television's sharpest interviewer? You won't believe what unfolds when Elon Musk faces off against Stephen Colbert in what became the most explosive interview in late show history. The tension was palpable from the moment Musk walked onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted the verbal warfare that would erupt between these two titans, ultimately leading to a confrontation so heated that it ended with Musk storming off set in a fury that left the entire studio audience stunned into silence. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses collide in what can only be described as television gold turned toxic. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert has seen its share of controversial moments, but nothing quite prepared the audience for what transpired when Elon Musk settled into that familiar guest chair. From the opening moments, there was an electric tension in the air that seasoned television viewers could sense immediately. Colbert, known for his razor-sharp wit and unflinching approach to holding powerful figures accountable, had clearly done his homework. Musk, meanwhile, carried himself with that characteristic blend of arrogance and defensiveness that has become his trademark in challenging interviews. The interview began innocuously enough, with Colbert's standard opening pleasantries and Musk responding with his typical awkward charm. But experienced Colbert watchers knew this was merely the calm before the storm. The host's questions started soft, discussing SpaceX achievements and Tesla's latest innovations, allowing Musk to settle into his comfort zone of discussing his technological ventures. However, those familiar with Colbert's interview style recognized the strategic setup. He was lulling his guest into a false sense of security before delivering the knockout punch. The first sign of trouble came when Colbert shifted gears with surgical precision. "Elon, let's talk about your approach to content moderation on X," Colbert said, his tone remaining deceptively casual while his eyes sharpened with intent. "You've positioned yourself as a free speech absolutist, but critics argue you've created a platform where hate speech and misinformation flourish unchecked. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Musk's demeanor immediately shifted. His previously relaxed posture stiffened, and that familiar defensive edge crept into his voice. "Stephen, I think you're mischaracterizing the situation entirely," he replied, his words measured but carrying an unmistakable undertone of irritation. "We've actually increased transparency and reduced actual censorship. The previous regime at Twitter was far more restrictive and biased in their content moderation." Colbert wasn't having it. "But Elon, studies have shown that hate speech has increased dramatically since your acquisition. The Anti-Defamation League, civil rights organizations, major advertisers, they're all raising serious concerns. Are they all wrong? Or is there something you're not seeing?" The billionaire's jaw tightened visibly. "The ADL has their own agenda, Stephen. They've been trying to pressure advertisers to boycott the platform because we won't bow to their particular definition of acceptable speech. It's actually quite authoritarian when you think about it." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably as the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Colbert leaned forward slightly, his interviewer instincts fully engaged. "Authoritarian? That's an interesting choice of words coming from someone who's been accused of using your platform to amplify conspiracy theories and attack journalists who write unfavorably about your companies." Musk's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Attacked journalists? I've simply pointed out when reporting is inaccurate or biased. Since when is fact-checking considered an attack? And as for conspiracy theories, I'd argue that the mainstream media peddles more conspiracy theories than anyone on X." The exchange was escalating rapidly, with both men now speaking in clipped, tense tones that suggested they were barely containing their frustration with each other. Colbert's legendary composure remained intact, but there was steel in his voice as he continued his line of questioning. "Let's be specific then," Colbert pressed. "You've promoted theories about vote manipulation, you've made disparaging comments about transgender individuals, and you've used your massive platform to target specific journalists and critics. How is that responsible use of your influence?" Musk's face flushed slightly, his hands gesturing more aggressively as he spoke. "I've raised legitimate questions about election integrity, which is something any citizen should be able to do. As for transgender issues, I simply believe in biological reality and parental rights. These aren't controversial positions outside of certain ideological bubbles. The studio was now thick with tension, audience members exchanging glances as they witnessed what was rapidly becoming a full-scale confrontation. Colbert's team behind the cameras looked increasingly concerned, recognizing that this interview had veered far from the typical late-night entertainment format into something more confrontational and unpredictable. Biological reality. Colbert's eyebrows shot up. Elon, you're talking about real people, real families who are already facing discrimination and violence. When someone with your platform spreads these views, it has real-world consequences. Don't you feel any responsibility for that? Musk's composure was beginning to crack more visibly. I feel responsibility for telling the truth, even when it's unpopular with certain activist groups. The idea that we can't have honest discussions about complex social issues because someone might be offended is exactly the kind of thinking that's destroying rational discourse. The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the usual playful sparring that characterized most Colbert interviews. This was two strong-willed men with fundamentally different worldviews engaging in intellectual combat, with neither willing to give ground. Colbert pressed on relentlessly. But Elon, when you tweet to your 100 million followers questioning the validity of pronouns or suggesting that certain medical treatments are child abuse, you're not just having a philosophical discussion. You're potentially putting vulnerable people at risk. The billionaire's face darkened considerably. Child abuse. Stephen, are you seriously suggesting that questioning the wisdom of irreversible medical procedures on minors is somehow harmful? That's exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that shuts down legitimate debate. The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, with both men now leaning forward in their chairs, their voices carrying an edge that suggested this was about to escalate beyond a simple disagreement. The studio audience remained frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply witness what was clearly becoming television history, though perhaps not the kind anyone had intended to make. What happened next would transform this already heated exchange into something that would be talked about for years to come, as the two titans prepared to engage in a battle of words that would ultimately prove too intense for primetime television. Colbert, sensing his guests' growing agitation, decided to press even harder on the most sensitive nerve he could find. Elon, let's talk about your recent behavior regarding your own children. You've publicly deadnamed your transgender daughter and claimed she was essentially killed by what you call the woke mind virus. How do you justify using your own family tragedy to score political points? The effect was immediate and devastating. Musk's entire body language shifted as if he'd been physically struck. His face went from flushed to pale in seconds, then back to a deep red that was visible even under the studio lights. "How dare you?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he had shouted. "How dare you bring my children into this circus?" But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by having found the exact pressure point that would crack his guests' carefully maintained facade. "You brought your children into this, Elon. You went on social media, you gave interviews, you made your family situation a public talking point. I'm simply asking you to explain your reasoning." Musk's hands were now gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone completely white. "My family situation? My family situation is that I've lost a child to an ideology that convinced him he was someone he wasn't. And now people like you want to celebrate that as some kind of victory for progress." The studio had become a powder keg. Several audience members looked visibly uncomfortable, some shifting in their seats, others covering their mouths in shock. The camera crew continued filming, but you could see the uncertainty in their faces as they captured what was clearly spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Elon, your daughter has publicly stated that you were an absent father who showed no interest in understanding her identity." Colbert continued with surgical precision. "She said you were more concerned with your public image than with actually supporting your child. How do you respond to that?" Something snapped in Musk's eyes. "You want to know about being an absent father? Let me tell you about being a father who worked 18-hour days to build companies that would secure his children's future, only to have ideological activists convince one of those children that their father is the enemy. You want to talk about absence? I was absent building rockets and electric cars. I wasn't absent when it came to loving my kids. His voice was rising now, the careful control he'd maintained throughout his public life completely evaporating. But apparently that doesn't matter when there are people making millions of dollars convincing confused teenagers that their parents are the problem. Colbert leaned back slightly, perhaps finally recognizing that he'd pushed his guest to a breaking point that might be dangerous for both of them. But his journalistic instincts wouldn't let him retreat. So you're saying your daughter's identity is just confusion? That the medical professionals, the therapists, the support networks, they're all part of some conspiracy? Conspiracy. Musk laughed, but it was a sound devoid of any humor, sharp and bitter. Stephen, you're looking at someone who's built multiple billion-dollar companies from scratch. I understand how systems work, how incentives drive behavior. When there are entire industries built around transitioning children, when there are massive financial incentives to affirm rather than question, when dissent is labeled as hatred. That's not conspiracy, that's just business. The audience was now completely silent, some looking like they wanted to leave, but were too transfixed by the unfolding disaster to move. This had gone far beyond entertainment into something raw and painful that felt too personal for public consumption. Business. Colbert's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and disgust. You're talking about your own child's life as if it's a business transaction. Do you hear yourself right now? Musk's composure finally shattered completely. He leaned forward, aggressively, pointing directly at his host. Don't you dare lecture me about my children. You sit here in your safe little studio, making jokes about people's lives for applause, and you think that gives you the right to judge how I handle the most painful situation any parent can face. The billionaire was now speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in his fury. You want to know what business is? Business is watching your child be convinced that everything you taught them about reality is wrong. Business is having strangers on the internet tell you that you're a monster for wanting to protect your kid from making irreversible decisions as a teenager. Protect. Colbert shot back, his own composure finally cracking slightly. Elon, protecting. Your child would have meant accepting who she is, not broadcasting your rejection of her identity to millions of people. That's not protection. That's public humiliation. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Musk sat back in his chair, as if he'd been slapped, his breathing visible and labored. For a moment, the studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. When Musk spoke again, his voice was low and dangerous. Public humiliation. That's rich, coming from someone who makes a living humiliating people for entertainment. Tell me, Stephen, how many lives have you destroyed for a laugh? How many people have you mocked and ridiculed from this very chair? I punch up, Elon. I go after people in power who can handle it. I don't attack vulnerable teenagers or use my platform to spread hatred against marginalized communities. Marginalized communities. Musk's voice was climbing again. You mean the communities that have convinced my child that I'm evil for questioning whether an 18-year-old should make life-altering medical decisions? Those marginalized communities seem pretty powerful to me. The confrontation had reached a level of intensity that was clearly beyond what anyone in the studio had prepared for. Producers were visible at the edges of the set, clearly debating whether to intervene. The audience looked like they were witnessing a car crash in real time, horrified but unable to look away. Colbert made one final attempt to regain control of the interview. Elon, I think we need to step back here. You're clearly dealing with a lot of pain, and maybe this isn't the right forum for working through family issues that are obviously very personal and complex. But Musk interpreted this as condescension, and it was the final straw. Step back? Oh, now you want to step back? After you've spent the last 20 minutes trying to destroy me on national television? After you've brought my children into your little political theater? He was standing now, his chair pushed back, his entire body radiating fury. You don't get to decide when we step back, Stephen. You don't get to poke and prod and attack, and then suddenly play the reasonable adult when your guest fights back. The studio erupted into chaos as what had been a heated interview transformed into something that threatened to become physical confrontation, with Musk towering over the seated host and the entire production teetering on the edge of complete collapse. Security personnel began moving from the wings, but Colbert raised a hand to stop them, never breaking eye contact with the furious billionaire looming above him. The host's years of experience dealing with volatile situations kicked in, But even his legendary composure was being tested by the raw intensity radiating from his guest. "Sit down, Elon," Colbert said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that cut through the chaos. "You're making this worse for yourself." But Musk was beyond reason now, his face contorted with rage and pain. "Making it worse? Making it worse." His voice cracked with emotion. "You've just spent 30 minutes trying to paint me as a monster on national television, and you think I'm making it worse by defending myself?" The billionaire's hands were shaking visibly as he pointed accusingly at his host. "You people are all the same. You hide behind your moral superiority while you destroy anyone who doesn't conform to your narrow worldview. You talk about compassion and understanding, but the moment someone disagrees with you, you try to annihilate them." Colbert remained seated, but his voice carried steel. "I'm not trying to annihilate anyone, Elon. I'm asking you to take responsibility for the harm your words and actions cause to real people. That's what journalists do." "Journalist?" Musk's laugh was harsh and mocking. "You're not a journalist, Stephen. You're a performer. You're a court jester who thinks his jokes make him wise. The difference between us is that I actually build things that matter. I don't just tear things down for applause." The audience was frozen in their seats, some filming with their phones despite security's attempts to discourage recording. This was television history being made, but not the kind anyone had intended. Colbert's patience finally reached its limit. He stood up slowly, bringing himself closer to eye level with his guest. "You want to talk about building things? Let's talk about what you've built, Elon. You've built a platform that amplifies hatred. You've built a public persona based on attacking anyone who challenges you. And apparently, you've built a family dynamic so toxic that your own daughter had to legally change her name to distance herself from you." The words hit Musk like a physical blow. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, pain, and finally, pure fury. "Get my daughter's name out of your mouth," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "You don't know anything about my family, and you sure as hell don't get to use my children as ammunition in your political games." "Political games?" Colbert's voice rose to match his guest's intensity. "Elon, you made this political when you decided to use your platform to attack transgender people, when you spread conspiracy theories, when you turned yourself into a right-wing culture warrior. You don't get to play the victim now." Musk's composure shattered completely. "Victim? I'm not playing the victim. I'm telling you that you're a sanctimonious hypocrite who gets paid to mock people while pretending to care about social justice. You want to know what's really harmful? It's people like you convincing the world that anyone who questions the progressive orthodoxy is evil." The billionaire began pacing behind his chair like a caged animal. "You sit here in your ivory tower, making millions by ridiculing people who actually take risks, who actually try to change the world, who actually put themselves on the line for something bigger than late-night comedy ratings. Put yourself on the line?" Colbert stood up fully now, his own anger finally breaking through his professional facade. "You're one of the richest men in the world, Elon. You have more power and influence than most world leaders. The only thing you've put on the line is your relationship with your own children." The studio gasped audibly. Even the camera operators looked shocked at how personal and vicious this had become. Musk stopped pacing and turned to face Colbert directly, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made everyone in the room take a step back. "That's it," Musk said, his voice deadly calm now. "I'm done with this circus. I'm done with your self-righteous posturing, your moral grandstanding, and your pathetic attempts to destroy me for having opinions you don't like." He began removing his microphone with sharp, aggressive movements. "You want to know what's really destroying this country? It's people like you who think that having a platform gives you the right to be judge, jury, and executioner of anyone who doesn't bow to your ideology." Colbert moved around his desk, his own anger now fully unleashed. "My ideology? My ideology is that people should be treated with dignity and respect, especially vulnerable people who are already facing discrimination. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why. Dignity and respect." Musk threw his microphone onto the chair with enough force that it bounced onto the floor. "You've spent this entire interview trying to humiliate me, bringing up my personal family tragedy, twisting my words, and then you lecture me about dignity and respect." The two men were now facing each other center stage, neither backing down. both radiating a hostility that made the air itself feel electric. The audience was completely silent, witnessing what felt like a gladiatorial combat between two titans of their respective worlds. "I brought up your public statements and actions," Colbert shot back. "If you can't handle being questioned about things you've said and done publicly, maybe you shouldn't be using your platform to attack marginalized communities." Musk's face twisted with contempt. Marginalized communities. There's that phrase again. You know what's really marginalized, Stephen? Truth. Rational discourse. The ability to have an honest conversation without being labeled a monster for asking difficult questions. He began walking toward the exit, his security team quickly falling into formation around him. But you don't want honest conversation. You want compliance. You want everyone to nod along with your worldview or be destroyed. Well, congratulations, you got your moment. You got to publicly humiliate someone who dared to disagree with you. Colbert followed him partway across the stage. "Elon, you're walking away because you can't handle being challenged. That's what bullies do when someone finally stands up to them." Musk stopped dead and whirled around, his face a mask of fury. "Bully? I'm the bully? You just spent 40 minutes trying to destroy my reputation, attacking my parenting, questioning my character, and I'm the bully for defending myself." His voice rose to a shout that echoed through the studio. "You want to see what a real bully looks like, Stephen? Look in the mirror. Look at someone who uses their platform to attack people while hiding behind the pretense of moral authority." With that, Musk turned and stormed toward the exit, his security team struggling to keep up with his aggressive pace. "This interview is over," he called over his shoulder. "And frankly, so is your credibility." The studio doors slammed shut behind him with a resounding crash that seemed to echo endlessly in the stunned silence that followed. Colbert stood alone on his stage, his chest heaving with adrenaline and anger, facing an audience that looked like they'd just witnessed a car crash. The host attempted to regain his composure, straightening his tie and walking back toward his desk. "Well," he said, his voice shaky but trying for humor, "that went better than expected." But the joke fell flat in the heavy atmosphere. The audience remained silent, processing what they'd just witnessed. This hadn't been entertainment. It had been a raw, brutal confrontation between two powerful men with fundamentally incompatible worldviews, and everyone in the room knew they'd just seen something that would be talked about for years to come. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras finally stopped rolling, the full weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. This wasn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a complete breakdown of civil discourse, a perfect encapsulation of the cultural and political divisions tearing the country apart, played out in real time before a horrified audience. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had just hosted what would undoubtedly become one of the most infamous moments in television history, and nobody involved would ever quite be the same.